Now, you might have wondered when you saw the advertisement for this talk tonight, what more can be said in an SSPX chapel, in an SSPX parish, full of well-formed traditional Catholics like yourselves about liberalism and the social kingship of Christ? What can be said that's not already been said? And I would answer that, sadly, we need reminding, because many Catholics fall back into liberalism. And what I intend to do tonight is to remind and recapitulate the Church's teaching on liberalism, and hopefully to offer a little bit of clarity and a little bit of a sense of how it's instantiated today. Because you hear a lot in political discourse about how we are maybe entering a post-liberal era. And I'd like to contend with that a little bit. I think that we are still very much within an era of hegemonic liberalism. There are signs of hope, and I'm going to finish with those. But I'm afraid that there's still a lot of ground to cover. Now, Sun Tzu says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And as Sean pointed out there at the beginning, I really think that once we recognise that liberalism really is the primary enemy, the main cause of the de-Christianisation of the West, of the crucifixion of Christendom, then we can really situate our own action as Catholic laity and also as Catholic clergy today. So I've subtitled this talk, Liberalism, Contradictions and Paradoxes. Patrick Deneen, a professor at Notre Dame in the US, he wrote, "Liberalism proclaims equal rights, but fosters incomparable material inequality. It rests its legitimacy on consent, yet it discourages public commitments in favour of privatism. It champions individual autonomy, yet has created the most comprehensive apparatus of the state in human history." So liberalism is confusing and it's contradictory. So straight away we know that we're dealing with something that is from the devil. And I think an episode which really encapsulates this was just under a year ago, the month of the most precious blood, July last year. It was the opening of the Olympic Games. And it gives an insight into how liberalism works and how diabolical it is. So in this month, which in the new liberal liturgical calendar, the paraliturgical calendar, is used to mark the Antichrist French Revolution with all its convoy of rotten fruits, which is followed in its train, we had this outrage of this blasphemous parody of the Last Supper that was presented to the world in Paris, the site of St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching and the capital of the eldest daughter of the church, very intentionally. And that was on July the 26th last year. But what was, I think, noticeable about how liberalism works and how it acts as a kind of mind virus is that the response of the French episcopacy, the French Episcopal Conference, in their press release the next day, was not to refer at all to the seriousness of the offence against God, or even to demand a public apology from the Olympic Committee, or even an offence against the Catholic Church, Christ's Catholic Church. Rather, all that was left was a lament for the hurt feelings of Christians. They actually invoked the discourse of the rights of man, of their feelings, of the need for a fraternal coexistence, tolerant of differences. Man matters, they said. What about the rights of God? Before we have Christians, there is Christ. Before we have the dignity of man, we have the majesty of God. That was all absent. So their response to this outrageous provocation actually served functionally to strengthen the ideology which had made the outrage possible in the first place. And liberalism works, I submit, in this diabolical, dialectical fashion, where criticism of liberalism made within the framework already authored by liberalism only serves to reinforce it. And that, I think, is really a key takeaway that we need to have as Catholics, that we don't situate our criticism or make our criticism from within liberalism itself. So, it is, I'm going to submit, the hegemonic political paradigm that we live in. It's the lens with which we view reality. It is the orthopedic framework of society, to such an extent that really we have to explain something like water to fishes, to really abstract from that and explain that this isn't actually how human affairs are meant to be organised, is a very arduous mission. So whether we're talking about Sir Keir Starmer, Donald Trump, Pope Francis, Nigel Farage, Jordan Peterson, Viktor Orban, Cardinal Nichols, these are all liberals in their public statements. And therefore, I would say the right-left game is inadequate for understanding political life. These are categories of nominalism, and they arise from the French Revolution, as you are probably aware, which itself presupposes liberal assumptions. Miguel Ayuso said, quote, "The Western world today is a mixture of a capitalist economic structure with fiscal socialism and moral secularism, a kind of collectivist individualism, paradoxical as it may seem. Of course, this is a structural problem of liberalism. It leads to its self-destruction. The situation is particularly complex because it is a pincer from which it is difficult to escape. Mass society imbrutes and reduces responsibility, but the remedies to get out of it, if the international panorama would allow it, are not assumable by the corrupted societies." And then Father Juan Maria Latorre wrote, quote, "Like a vampire, liberalism sucked the lifeblood out of God's work, stripping it of its roots, its family, lineage and ancestors, its heritage and environment, its customs and traditions, its beliefs and feelings, and even its language and accent, making perfidy the language of money, commerce and rebellion. Yes, rebellion, for liberalism was born from nothing other than rebellion, from the Luciferian non-serviam, from declaring itself a self-determined individual, free from vassalage to its lord. And in the face of the atrocity and barbarism of this liberalism, erroneous responses were born because they were based on the same principles. And today, as always, Carlism, it's a Spanish traditionalist movement, proclaims and shouts the only response that will restore the true order and foundation of reality. Long live Christ the King." So, this is a key message that I want to convey, that liberalism refers to a common project shared by the different colours of modernity, and that therefore only those who reject liberalism in its entirety, this common project that the right wing, defends often as much as progressivism, will be the ones who can truly call themselves politically incorrect. You might have encountered the works of Don Felix Salvini, the author of Liberalism is a Sin. And in that work, he distinguishes between three kinds of liberals. He talks about extreme liberals, moderate liberals, and quasi-liberals. And it's this last type which one finds sometimes among Catholics, among well-meaning Catholics. Like Madame de Sévigné, he can say, "I am not the rose, but I'm standing by it. I have caught some of its perfume." And Sean has said previously that it's a kind of spiritual work where we rejoice when we uncover layers of liberalism within ourselves that we can excavate and we can remove. And that's an ongoing process because we're all children of the revolution, in a certain sense. We were born in this era. And that's something we need to continue to observe within ourselves. This year is the centenary of Quos Primas, which was Pope Pius XI's encyclical establishing the reign of, the feast day of the reign of Christ the King. And I'm going to lay out how this doctrine is unavoidable. It is essential to the Church's mission, and without it, the coherence of Christianity just falls apart. So I'm going to try and do 4 things this evening. Firstly, I'm going to attempt to try and define liberalism. I'm going to offer a definition of liberalism, which actually is quite difficult because while it's been referred to at length in the Church's magisterium, given its shifting nature, it can be quite difficult to pin down, but various esteemed Catholic thinkers will help us there. Secondly, I'm going to examine the philosophical roots and presuppositions of the ideology, which helps to expose how anti-Christian it is. And then thirdly, and this is what I think is a little bit more germane to our moment, I'm going to offer some observations as to how liberalism is contorting and moving today, with particular focus on the temptations of right-wing liberalism, as newer forms of left-wing liberalism metastasize, and how what gets called conservatism functions as an agent that preserves the revolution. And then finally, I'm going to finish by advocating and commenting on the social kingship of Christ. What began as a battle, a political battle, of liberalism against Christendom can only find its solution at a certain level in politics itself. So I'm not advocating quietism here, and actually this catastrophic situation of the hegemony of liberalism we are in today does offer signs of the very, very beginning of renewal, I'm going to submit. The night is darkest before the dawn. So, to start with then, defining liberalism. I think one of the best definitions, magisterial definitions, was given by Pius IX in his decisive writing Quanta Cura, which accompanied the Syllabus of Errors. There he said, quote, "Some men, liberals, utterly neglecting and disregarding the surest principles of sound reason, dare to proclaim that the people's will, manifested by what is called public opinion, or in some other way constitutes a supreme law, free from all divine and human control, and that in the political order accomplished facts, from the very circumstance they are accomplished, have the force of right. But who does not see and clearly perceive that human society, when set loose from the bonds of religion and true justice, can have, in truth, no other end than the purpose of obtaining and amassing wealth?" End quote. That's a characteristic of liberalism that I'm going to return to, that by claiming political neutrality, what it actually ends up offering is a kind of nihilistic hedonism as the highest good for the public order. So this isn't just progressive liberalism. This is an ideology, as Pope Pius IX points out, that is based on this idea of popular sovereignty and privatising the good, that we cannot define and agree on socially what the common good is. Therefore, its first and most fundamental affirmation is religious liberty. The highest action that man can carry out are actions of religion. And so liberalism pretends to prescind from questions of religion and say, well, we can just agree to disagree. But of course, by doing that, it lays down all sorts of presuppositions, all sorts of assumptions. So liberalism gives its own definition. It says freedom is the right to demand that others not interfere in your life. So in other words, the liberal identifies freedom with what we can call negative freedom, the ability to act without any limits, as long as one does not interfere in the life of others. Thus understood, freedom is the right to choose between good and evil, as long as it does not harm anyone unintentionally. That's why, to give a recent example, euthanasia is quite illustrative of the liberal debate at work, debate within liberalism. The left liberal says, I have the right to choose my own death, and you have no right to coerce me, because you would be interfering with my freedom. The right liberals, or liberal Catholics, then have a kind of schizophrenia in how they respond to it. They don't have a strong foundation in which to counter the left liberal case. They're forced to reject euthanasia, but they're incapable of offering a rational, non-religious argument, since their minds are steeped in liberalism. And therefore, for a liberal, it's radically impossible to take a stand against euthanasia, since it's coming from the autonomous, self-authoring individual that is requesting to commit suicide. By contrast, classical political thought, and then later Christian thought, which baptized that classical inheritance, has always specified that not every act performed freely perfects freedom, since the will is by its nature finalized in the good of the person. However, in the exercise of my freedom, it is possible to commit evil, to act against what is good, corrupting our will. Precisely by embracing evil or vice, I am corrupting my freedom. I am becoming less free. The more vicious I become, the less free I am. And this is described very beautifully by Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical Libertas. So in this way, the limit of freedom is not freedom itself, but truth. I am freer if I direct my actions towards the truth, if I act truthfully. Hence, the truth makes us free. And in that evangelical maxim, there is a clear subordination of freedom to truth. Liberalism does not relate freedom to truth, but rather to an illusory capacity to self-determine at any time as I wish and without any limits. There's no reason to deny the freedom to commit suicide, the freedom to self-harm, the freedom to change my sex. A very stark expression of this is the infamous mystery clause penned by that nominal Catholic, Justice Anthony Kennedy, in 1992 in the majority of opinion of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. He said, quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." Of course, end quote, Kennedy's definition of liberty is pure solipsism. It's atheistic or at minimum agnostic, and you can just see there that that is the basis of anarchy. You cannot have a political order which would enshrine such a neglect of the important questions about the meaning of life, man's destiny, human nature. Hayek, who is very beloved of a certain sort of libertarian conservatives, said that freedom is so important because we do not know how individuals will use it, which, in the words of Father Calderon of the Society, is as foolish as defining health as the ability to get sick. This has grave implications in law, and that I think is really important because we live in a time of lawlessness, which is very pre-apocalyptic. Law is established under liberalism no longer to make men good, as the classics would prove and as Catholicism teaches, but to guarantee strictly individual goods. Law no longer interprets order, man creates it with his conscience and expects the state to recognize it. The philosopher Friedrich Wilhelmsen pointed to the example of Weimar Germany in the last century, which was very proud of the fact that it was a, quote, an open society. He said that a political society without an end is an open society. It can be called open because it does not believe in anything. It does not affirm anything. Weimar Germany was an almost totally and completely open society. We say almost because some of the traditions of the West still survived there. For example, a murderer was pursued by the police. A swindler ended his career in jail. And that, of course, is why society, the order that we live in now, the regime, does not just collapse, because there is still that vestigial sensitivity, instinct towards the common good among the English people, and even some residual Christian culture as well. But abstracting from this very minimal morality, Weimar Germany admitted any doctrine by having none of its own, and thus an ideological vacuum is created. But man cannot live within a vacuum, given that intelligence and will demand a response to the public problems of life. So as a result, you have political parties are born. And as Dr. Alan Phimister said, political parties were never anything more than secularised Protestant denominations with nothing to say. They are there to try and fill this void, and each one of them preaches its own doctrine or orthodox politics. And this produces a kind of struggle between the parties, which then means that the society begins to lose its peace and order that it would have had if it had been a closed society instead of an open one from the beginning. The liberal vacuum, Frederick Wilhelmsen writes, known to many countries during this century, produced reactions as a result from the left and from the right. And these positions make sense within the liberal state and only within it. Medieval Christendom did not know this kind of factional party political strife. It really only follows from the French Revolution, from liberalism. The left threatened the property and social authority of the upper classes. The right defended them. The proletarian mass clashed with the ruling classes. So liberalism pretends to be neutral. It pretends that it's just in the business of creating a neutral political space where people's ideas about the meaning of life can compete in a kind of free market. But in fact, all societies and institutions are inspired by an idea of what man and his destiny is. There is no way you can construct a society without having some assumptions behind it. So by pretending to be neutral, liberalism just says these questions are just not important, which means that the implication is the philosophy of that society is necessarily nihilistic hedonism. And we can see that continually getting worse and debasing in our society in its advanced decayed state. So I'm going to now turn, secondly, to liberal anthropology and cosmology, look into the roots of the ideology, how it can propose such a vacuous political ideology. When you think about the richness of medieval Christendom and of Catholic political philosophy, the incredible synthesis between faith and reason, perfected by St. Thomas Aquinas, how can liberalism challenge that? How is it able to have this grip on men's minds? Well, it followed the false philosophy of nominalism. And that led to a different view of human nature, because nominalism denies natures. So we can no longer say what the nature of man is objectively, and we can no longer say what a good man looks like objectively either. So in contrast to the classical conception of social life, in which the common good transcends and enhances the individual for the sake of mankind's ultimate goal, this is what Pope Pius XII called the principle of totality, which balances the principle of subsidiarity. For liberalism, the natural sociability that they uphold has to do with mankind's mere need for defence, with a mere instinct of preservation and protection. Now, this comes from thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who theorised about this mythical state of nature. It never happened, it's ahistorical. But it shows how it's an ideology based on fear, that nature is red in tooth and claw, that man in his natural state experiences life which is nasty, brutish and short, and therefore we form political societies to preserve and protect private property, but not because there's an inherent sociability within us. Whereas, for Catholic political philosophy, mankind is naturally sociable, and it's not just to protect himself, but it is to perfect himself. That, abstractly considered, the city, that is the civil society, I don't like using the term state, it's a bit problematic, maybe deal with that in the questions. But political society is a perfect society, or at least is potentially a perfect society. Man can perfect himself and be protected, can realise his natural end. And that makes sense, because otherwise God would have made us as mere irrational animals. So you can see here how the Hobbesian anthropology lends itself to a Darwinian account of man's origins, because it already sinks man back down into the realm of bestiality, of a bestial nature, by denying his natural sociability. The traditional vision of law actually has its deepest roots in Trinitarian theology. The eternal Logos is reflected in the intrinsic order of creation. It's a network of intelligible and teleological relations in which each element has its right place. This is often referred to by the medievals as the great chain of being. That every creature that God created has its place within his order. And these creatures and this network is interwoven by relations, and these relations include relations of debt, relations of obligation, such as the man owes treatment of others according to how they treat him. This is giving what is due, the right, jus, justice. The honour that I owe to my parents, the just price that I owe to the one who I sell to and who is selling me something, the obedience that I owe to my fatherland, the truth that I owe to the one who is listening to me, the care that I owe to my children, the religion that I owe to God, etc. These are all debt relationships, obligations. And this Trinitarian cosmology, having been denied by nominalism, Protestantism, and rationalism, obscured and denied these natural and intelligible debt relationships between men. So the just man becomes the one who expects nothing from anyone, as long as the rest expect nothing from him. This is the genesis of individualism, not seeing ourselves as a social animal. So the term right then gets denatured. And this again is why it's so difficult to dialogue, debate with liberals, because you're actually not using the same, you haven't got the same definitions of terms. So the church believes in human rights, but not in the way that a liberal does. So for the liberal, right goes from referring to a debt relationship, as a Catholic reads it, to referring to an absence of debt between men. It is the power, for example, to dispose of my property, to make a free expression, to dispose of my soul as I wish, without owing anything to anyone. Okay, so considering that, let's just consider a little bit more the church's anthropology, the Catholic anthropology, why it makes sense. Henry Sear wrote, "Christianity asserts the social nature of faith, but actually nearly all belief is social. Liberalism's claim of autonomous, self-authoring individuals making a religious choice from an impartial survey of equally presented options is a figment. In most of their beliefs, whether religious or other, the majority of people simply follow common opinion." End quote. So, I mean, you can conduct a thought experiment or think of incidents in your own lives. If you had a room like this full of secular fellow English men and women, and you were to ask people's opinions on abortion or Brexit, and ask for a show of hands, what's the first thing that you would see? You'd see everybody look around to see what everyone else is doing. So there's an inherent sociality within man. There's that search for social permission. Where is the crowd going? That's how true the statement that Aristotle made, that man is a social animal, is. The church knew this. The church knows this. So in the face of this naive principle of liberalism that ignores this reality and elevates naivete to a kind of moral principle, we have to recognise the prime influence of human behaviour is generally not right reason, often, but carnal self-interest. That is the bent of concupiscence, of fallen human nature. And this is a purposeful move that liberalism makes, because the priesthood of liberalism, Freemasonry, the children of darkness, take over the media, the organs of public information, and then they can manipulate public opinion to manufacture consent and progress the revolution. It's notable that every stage of the revolution, the majority of people in this country were against the legalisation of abortion. But they are able to get it through their media domination. So liberalism has a purpose behind doing this. Father Thomas Crean, who authored a book called Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy, it's very illuminating on these political questions. He likened this to the economic principle of Gresham's law, which states that bad money drives out good money. So it's particularly in ages when you had metal money, precious metals, what you had, at least was very common, was coin clipping, or debasing the currency. And what happens when those sort of behaviours spread is that people start to hoard the good money under their mattress at home, the money with a higher gold content, for example, because they are hedging on the future that it's going to be worth more. And Father Crean talks about a kind of intellectual or political equivalent of Gresham's law, that bad ideas drive out good ideas. There's that quote from St. Augustine, which actually I would like to look more into the citation for that you just need to let the truth free and that it will look after itself. That's not quite the case, that actually the truth does need defending. That's what St. Augustine himself realised when the Donatists were spreading their errors and preventing Catholics from receiving the sacraments. He actually cooperated with the Roman police to forcibly coerce the Donatists, to coerce the heretics. That was very much a watershed moment when the church reached to the secular arm to enforce the truth. Now, it doesn't mean forced conversion, but it means extirpation of heresy. It means protecting the truth because of this bent of human nature towards error and sin. Okay, so human rights, this term which is kind of like a philosopher's stone of contemporary politics. Somebody just needs to invoke human rights and the argument ends. You can see that's the kind of ground of the of political ideology for most liberals, is protecting human rights. So, Sia says, an essential right is one that is necessary to the fulfillment of one's nature. A right is what is right. And the idea of such a right in human beings must therefore depend on one's view of human nature. Human dignity derives from him being made in the image and likeness of God. The dignity of man is exalted in proportion as he conforms to his Father, and debased in proportion as he falls from him. So a man confirmed in sanctity to his Creator is, after the angels, the most godlike creature God could possibly have made. But one who spurns his Creator, who rejects God's grace, is the most degraded thing that can exist, lower than the brute creation. There is no equality of rights that can be drawn between them. Human rights and human dignity can only be understood in relation to God. He is their source and their value. It depends on conformity to their source. Man has no human rights that conflict with his nature as child of God. Therefore, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which the French bishops invoked, of 1789, and the UN Declaration in 1948 are antichrist. They deny God's sovereignty. Man is not sovereign, God is sovereign. And that's worth bearing in mind as we hear people, or churchmen and Catholics, resort to human rights as some kind of protection against aggressive antichrist liberalism. And in fact, they're just resorting to the same the principles of the enemy, basically. They're fighting the battlefield on the enemy's ground. And of course, we know human rights just get redefined as soon as you write it down. Well, we have a right to life. It's there. It's the first right in the UN definition. But we have reproductive rights now. And so this new right then comes in and supersedes. That's legal positivism, that once it's written down, it's law that is constructed rather than law that is discovered in God's order. And there's a deep liberal hypocrisy. This comes with the paradoxes and contradictions that I mentioned earlier.
If we think back to the 1960s, when the official hierarchy effectively renounced the social kingship of Christ, at that time, no reasonable person would think it strange that the civil power in Mohammedan or Buddhist countries would privilege its own religious tradition. And in fact, Catholicism has always been more tolerant of others than the ideology of liberalism. The church made no use of compulsion in the first centuries, up until, as I say, the 4th century and 5th century, and only changed when its faith was established in Europe among the majority of people and found itself challenged by heretics. Contrast this with the hostility of liberalism towards the church when it arose in the 18th and 19th centuries, despoiling church property, expelling religious and priests, and imposing its own secular instruction in schools and universities, all from a minority position. Right? So they vaunt popular sovereignty, they weaponise that, but actually, during the French Revolution, the majority of Frenchmen remained baptised, believing Catholics. So they're able to, in a certain sense, kind of diabolically make true what they claim about a kind of popular apostasy before that's actually taken place. Similarly, Catholic countries in the period between the Protestant Revolt and the Revolution were actually much less religiously regimented, for example, not compelling church attendance. That's never been a civil law. Than, for example, the Puritan theocracies of Massachusetts or Geneva. These were much more religiously coercive societies. In France in 1993, an African woman was sentenced to prison for subjecting her daughters to female circumcision, even though the practice was required by her ancestral religion. And she was unaware of the French law against it. So there you have an example that liberalism does not allow for free practice of one's religion. This is something that Sean has discussed before about how public, for example, the reception of sacraments by David Amos as he was dying was blocked by the civil authority. So of course there's always going to be cases where somebody has to decide what freedom of religion means. And in that case, the civil authority prevented the practice of the Catholic religion, which is necessary for salvation. So it's not something Catholicism can collaborate with. I'm now on to part 3. I'm going to look at the phenomenon today of cultural Marxism, or woke, and how this is really misleading terminology in my view. So I'm sure you've noticed the main buzzword on the right today is woke. And it's maybe the preeminent theme on the right wing, alongside immigration. And there are entire conferences, academic journals, even now an academic course at the University of Buckingham, reams of print journalism, millions of hours of podcast discussions on this phenomenon of woke. And it's this characteristically vague terminology that you encounter all the time within right-wing circles. Another one they use, they talk about the blob. So the big problem we've got is the blob. And it's just so automatically prohibitive of any kind of clear, fruitful political action to begin with those kind of terms. Now, people talk about woke, then others say, well, what it means is cultural Marxism, and we prefer not to use that because several of the authors who were very important in cultural Marxism were from a certain background, and so we're just going to say woke to just stay away from that topic. But actually, that's really not helpful either, this term cultural Marxism. So, turning to Pius XI, in his encyclical Divini Redemptoris, he already denounced the relationship between liberalism and Marxism. He said, quote, "There would be neither socialism nor communism if the rulers of the people had not scorned the teachings and material warnings of the church, but governments preferred to build on the foundations of liberalism and secularism other social structures, which although at first glance seemed to present a firm and grandiose appearance, have very soon demonstrated their lack of solid foundations, so that one after another they have collapsed miserably,
as everything must necessarily collapse that is not supported by the only cornerstone, which is Jesus Christ, end quote.
So this sense of negative freedom during this period of strong modernity, when you still had a sense of universals, of a strong nation state, the ownership of it remained in the hands of the state as a guarantee of this negative freedom. But after the Second World War, we've had this further decomposition that Pius XI refers to there into what Miguel Quesada calls weak modernity, which situates the revolutionary subject from rather than the state to the individual, after maybe passing through the proletariat or the nation. But look at what the wokesters, the cultural Marxists, actually demand. They demand liberation. They demand freedoms. Right? This is just a continuation of liberalism. Political correctness is not just the fruit of Marxism, or of cultural Marxism, but of liberalism in its most radical version after the revolution of May 1968. Miguel Ayuso says it's not cultural Marxism, it's Gramscianism. That is, a Marxism that has shed its communist past and clothed itself in collectivist liberalism. It is incomprehensible without Americanism. Its attribution to Marxism is a crude conservative maneuver to attribute to communism what is the fault of liberalism. And the fact is that stirring up the scarecrow of anti-communism continues to be profitable for conservative liberalism. Of course, the problem is liberal democracy. Classical Marxism has disappeared today, and so-called cultural Marxism is nothing but radical liberalism. So I think that's really helpful for us to bear in mind then when we see this dialectic today that forms between the sort of woke, globalist, Marxist side of the world order and then the national populist, Zionist, classical liberal side. But they are both liberal, basically. And so that should really inform our political action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about conservatism in its history. Conservatism really is a branch of liberalism. In the 19th century, in Catholic countries in particular, conservative parties were called moderates. They wanted to moderate the revolution. Not against the revolution, just want to moderate it. They don't want to destroy too quickly the remnants of the old order, but they want to slow down the process, which actually serves to consolidate it. Once the stabilisation is achieved, since the consolidation of liberalism in itself is impossible, it's a destructive ideology, the revolution advances again. Today, often you find among conservative Catholics, that tradition is seen as a kind of accumulated progress. And they fail to see that liberalism is anti-tradition, but can still be conservative. Let me give you an example. You see today a lot of discourse around values, and some conservatives think, well, they're being very firm in using that kind of vocabulary because that's something that's objective and we can really fight from. But it really, Don Rafael Gambra says, is a kind of resource to dilute what one does not want to express openly, or to try and mask what one says. So, okay, you talk about values, human values, ethical values, democratic values. What you will not really find often is an express allusion to Catholicism, or even to a specific religion. So in many nominally Catholic schools, the most you will find is a vague reference to an education inspired by Christian humanism. And this is most often the result of what was called human respect, or of this belief that success will be greater if the base is broadened by hiding the apostolic intention among vagueness. And to that, you can only look to the words of our Lord, "Whoever is ashamed of me before men, I will be ashamed before the Father who is in heaven." So what conservatives do is, like Hercules, seek to cut off the head of the Hydra. And each time they cut off a head, the beast grows another 3 heads. As Aristotle points out, negation is not definition. If we're anti-communist, if we're anti-woke, that's not enough. I mean, a lot of leftists are right in a certain sense that we need to be defined by what we affirm rather than what we criticise. Thus, in the name of anti-communism, revolutionary conceptions such as liberalism or fascism end up being justified. The fallacy of understanding that the negation of Marxism constitutes a political affirmation leads to the complete opposite, the dissolving, the dissolution of politics in a kind of a mix of opinions, which end up being as revolutionary as Marxism. How did this come about? How have Catholics today ended up assuming this kind of defeatist logic? Well, the Second Vatican Council, of course, is a really important event, but actually that's something that we're aware of and we can talk more about. But this defeatist logic had entered into ecclesiastical circles before the council, and I think that's worth bearing in mind. Today you see a lot of discourse that says, well, we need to fight, we need to kind of base our entire political struggle on the family. But that makes the family the bulwark to which we cling against the onslaught of the modern world. But rightly understood, that's not its right place. The question of the conversion of the city has to actually be addressed in those terms, in converting the political authority. So as the revolution advanced, after the French Revolution, there arose a kind of clerical, ecclesiastical tendency which was tempted to baptize the achievements of the revolution against it. This is something Archbishop Lefebvre talks about to some degree in Day of Uncrowned with regard to the ralliement, the condemnation of Action Française, these actions which took place particularly in France, where faced with the liberal state, the ecclesiastics, many clerics, renounced political combat. And first of all, they took refuge not in the family, they took refuge in society. They started talking about civil society. They said things like more society, less state. So what they were doing was tacitly conceding, okay, we're not going to demand that the state, the political authority, recognise the kingship of Christ, the truth of the Catholic religion, because then we'll start getting persecuted, things will get quite hot. So we will say, well, we've got to have a Catholic pillar in society. And this was a process called pillarisation, which was particularly in mixed countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, France to an extent, Germany, where you could literally live within one section of society, and there was a Catholic football team, and there was a Catholic school system, there was Catholic trade unions, there were Catholic television channels later on, Catholic radios, there was also a Calvinist pillar as well, there was a liberal pillar, and you kind of had that as a modus vivendi. Now, of course, we would all kind of love to live in such a settlement compared to what we have now. But it's important to note that these concessions are risk, at least, disobeying our Lord's command to go and make disciples of all nations. So you had the reliance on society, and then slowly you had an expulsion of the church's influence. For example, in France in 1905, with the separation of church and state. And this leads to the church, through things like the ralliement, starting to talk about, well, there's a healthy secularism, or there is a space, there is legitimate autonomy for the civil power. That's a kind of second abandonment. And then you have the next point of retreat, which is to hide in the family homes, and makes the family a kind of instrument of resistance. Because if society could not resist an anti-Christian governing state, the family could not resist in a society of disbelief. And now, following the council, the destruction of the family has led to them now centering resistance on the individual, the dignity of the human person. And each time we're giving ground, the loss has been such that, confusing the question of fact with that of law, they assume the entirety of enemy thought, using the legal translation of subjective sovereignty, or the sovereignty of subjectivity, which is the true cause of evil. That's the negative freedom. Okay, so practically speaking, what does this mean? Well, I encounter, I'm sure you have as well, traditional Catholics who get involved in the Reform Party, for example, or they appear on GB News to offer commentary on how Francis was a great unifier. And I think that these Catholics in America, among the Republican Party, or Vox in Spain, they sometimes talk about an entryist strategy, where we might go under the radar of the liberal ideologies of these parties and then sort of convert them from within. But this is against the grain of Catholic thought and praxis. Francisco Canals said, "The moderation of bad principles is often very effective in doing harm and weakening good, while moderation in affirming good principles makes their application impossible." So if you get involved in the Reform Party and you start talking about how Mohammedan populations are threatening religious freedom, you're starting to affirm those liberal principles, and that's going to make it very difficult to ever advocate for the social kingship of Christ. Evil arises from the lack and deprivation of full good, while good is constituted by the complete perfection of a reality or action. And this is my friend Miguel Casada. He says very strongly, "Entryism, a tactic typical of the children of darkness and not of the children of light, leads to three forms of lying. The first is to convince ourselves that we are not participating in evil, which is self-deception. The second is to drag others into cooperating with evil, which is deception. And the last one, once the sterility of the attempt is evident, is disenchantment. Entryism suffers from an assumption of modern politics, founded on voluntary consensus, without understanding that politics operates in a qualified manner in the pursuit of common goals, so that it is the whole that moves the parts, not the other way round." In other words, you won't convert the Conservative Party or Reform. The Reform or Conservative Party will convert you. And we've seen that happen time and time again. So, by contrast, let's look to the social kingship of Christ. Let's go back to St. Augustine. He analysed civil power, and he began by taking Cicero's definition of the people of a republic as a multitude united in association by a community of interest and a common sense of right, or jus. Augustine continues, there can be no jus without justitia. There can be no right without righteousness, justice, which is to render to each one his due. Of course, the first one to whom jus is due is Almighty God, since he is the creator, sustainer, and perfecter of all things. The jus due to God is true worship, in the manner that he has ordained, which is the propitiatory sacrifice of Christ, represented at the Catholic altar of the Holy Mass. Augustine concludes, there is no justice save in that republic whose founder and ruler is Christ. For Augustine, then, a temporal polity derives its legitimacy from its insertion into the order of true worship, which is universal and supranational, the city of God, the res publica Christiana, or Christ's church. Without the just worship of the Holy Mass at the heart of the civil order, any given city, according to St. Augustine, will degenerate into a latrocinium, a kind of community of brigands, united in association by a common agreement on the object of their brigandage, a division of the loot, which is exactly what Pope Pius IX said. Augustine spoke approvingly of the reply given to Alexander the Great by a pirate that he had captured. When asked by the king what the pirate meant by keeping hostile possession of the sea, the man responded, "Why, the same as what you mean by seizing the whole earth. But because I do it with a petty ship, I am called a robber, while you who does it with a great fleet are styled emperor." End quote. Augustine believed that these pagan latrocini were inspired by a similar desire to grasp, as alluded to by St. Paul in Philippians. This is St. Paul, Philippians. Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to grasp, to be equal with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, and in habit formed as a man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient unto death, even to the death of the cross. So that word grasp there in the Greek is clearly an allusion to Adam and Eve taking of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and to Satan saying, "I will make myself like the Most High." By refusing to worship God in the manner that he is appointed, man claims a kind of equality with God. He is grasping, and that grasping upwards also corresponds to a grasping downwards. It's through the brigandage of trying to make himself equal with God, man becomes the brigandage that infests the earth. He becomes that pirate. It is this libido dominandi, the lust to dominate, that turns the pagan polities into latrocinae, effectively competing criminal organisations. For Augustine, the idea that you could have a religiously neutral polity founded only on the desire of enrichment, a higher GDP or sustainable development goals or whatever it is, that's simply an attempt to create Babylon by technology and the will to power. So, this brings me to quas primas. Secularism, Pope Pius XI says, is a kind of sin consisting of the refusal to submit to higher powers, as spoken of by St. Thomas and by St. Augustine. If we think about the context of quas primas in 1925, obviously it was following the previous anti-liberal papal teaching. He points to the inconsistency of the distinction used in conservative circles between an anti-Christian secularism and a supposedly positive secularism, which is effectively what Vatican II baptised. This follows the thought of Jacques Maritain, his integral humanism. This, in the end, however, amounts to nothing more than a system of neutral coexistence between faiths of an Americanist nature. I think this is how you can talk about the American captivity of the church today. So, back to quas primas. It's coming after a time of great global turmoil, the end of the last structures and polities of the Christian social order during the First World War, the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, heir to the Holy Roman Empire, the end of the German, Russian and Ottoman empires, leaving a vacuum that triggered power struggles. Western civilization, whose roots lay in Christianity, was shaken by the emergence of ideologies promoting a new secular order, seeking to eliminate the influence of the church. At a time when religion seemed to be losing ground to secularism, atheism, and the rise of authoritarian regimes, Pius XI affirmed that true order and peace could only be achieved under the social reign of Christ. The message responded to contemporary ideologies that challenged the role of the church in public life. Prominent among these were communism, after the 1917 Russian Revolution, promoting an atheistic state, and fascism, which under Mussolini defended a totalitarian state in Italy. Pius XI wrote, quote, "The world has suffered and continues to suffer this flood of evils because the immense majority of humanity has rejected Jesus Christ and his most holy law in their lives and customs, in domestic life and in the life of the Republic, and any sure hope of true international peace is impossible as long as individuals and cities obstinately deny the reign of our Saviour." End quote. Now I think Pope Pius XI's message it resonates anew today. And I think actually, this is what I'm going to finish with, saying this is very timely on this centenary. Because I find, when talking to non-Catholics, a question in their mind, which might not be articulated, but is there and is sort of implicitly behind other questions, is the following. What would society look like if everybody were Catholic? And what this shows is that the Catholic faith is not plausible unless you can explain how it will transform the whole of human society. That's what lies behind a lot of people's considerations. They think about a Catholic world and whether they would like it, which is why defending Christendom, defending the Christian social order as just and charitable is so important. That is our great example. Conversely, in Protestant England, the idea was very powerful over the centuries that you wouldn't like a Catholic order. There was the bogeyman of papal tyranny and the Jesuits and the Spanish Inquisition to keep people from considering the Catholic faith. And of course, this is a reasonable question because man is a social and political animal. You're not really preaching the whole gospel to him unless you are preaching it to the whole person, the social person. You have to be able to say what his social world would look like if it accepted the gospel. And so, the paramount mission of the laity in particular is to fight for the kingship of our Lord, the restoration of the Catholic city, as St. Pius X says. It is dangerous to forget this duty and to fall, even within the traditionalist world, into turning lay people into clerics concerned with chapel matters. I mean, how many traditionalist podcasts are about liturgy and clerical matters rather than about the temporal sphere? The duty of the layperson is preeminently political. So why is this reasonable? Because we can know the existence of God and the immortality of the soul through natural reason. We can then give ear to the Church's motives of credibility, the historical reliability of the Gospels, the prophecies of Scripture, the miracles, the excellence of the Church's doctrine. The Church has all the guns when it comes to apologetics. What is implied when the Church starts promoting religious liberty? It is as if the truths of the faith were just not certain enough to be the basis of the social and political order. And if they're not certain enough to be the basis of the civil order, then they're not certain enough to die for. And if they're not certain enough to die for, then the whole basis of Christianity is just destroyed. It becomes incoherent. And that's the story of the Church since the Second Vatican Council. So, the key lies in tradition. It is necessary to return to that order prior to the liberal rupture in order to restore things to their original and true purpose. It is necessary to return to tradition. The political and social doctrine of the Church, the Kingship of Christ, says that we can take seriously and know the answer to what human nature is and what man's destiny is, and that when we engage on that plane and on those questions as important and soluble and the true basis of political and social organisation, then Catholicism necessarily prevails. So if Catholicism is not prevailing today, the corollary of this, then it's because we're not engaging on that plane. We're not having the courage to follow our Lord's command to preach the gospel, to preach him, to not be ashamed of him. So today, in late modernity, as evil seems to have unleashed more and more, we're getting to a stage very close to official persecution, state legislation against Christianity. In fact, it's there in many ways. We recall the Latin phrase, motus in fine velocior, movement accelerates towards the end. Perhaps the birth pangs of Revelation quickening. I believe as things get worse, the imperative for the preaching of the Kingship of Christ will become more and more pressing, and I think you can already see that today. So hope for the restoration of Christian civilization remains intact, even more so in a world that is sinking from all sides. As I said earlier, the political end, social kingship of Christ, requires political means. That doesn't necessarily mean party political means, or the liberal structures, but political means. And in our case, this requires a solid formation in Catholic political doctrine, and then a method aligned with those principles, utterly detached from modern ideologies. Ultimately, there is no choice for lay Catholics, but to strive to subject the temporal order to Christ the King. God is the one who will decide if we are successful. What he'll judge us on at our particular judgment is whether we tried. With its escalating persecution and depravity, the liberal regime is extending the warfare and dissension that characterise tyranny into our homes. As Sebastian Morello put it, and I think he's spoken here before, quote, "We will either have Christendom or martyrdom," end quote. There is no enduring option of liberal bourgeois comfort. And just to share an anecdote, I spoke to someone who was at the St. Paul's boys' school parents' evening, where there was a room like this of more than 200 very affluent parents or families, and they were asked with regard to university applications something like, who feels positive, who feels hopeful about the future that your son is going to go into, that they're going to have a better standard of living, etc. And I think there was one hand in the whole room. So this is something that everyone feels, and so actually there's a real opportunity here. So I encounter many people who say the current temporal panorama is depressing. I say, on the contrary, it is cause to rejoice. To quote St. Paul, Romans, by whom also we have access through faith into this grace, wherein we stand and glory in the hope of the glory of the sons of God. And not only so, but we glory also in tribulations, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, end quote. So I'll finish by saying, take heart, victory is ours, and as our Lord says, he who perseveres to the end will be saved. Thank you very much for listening. Bit of time for any questions that might have arisen. Anthony?
Do you think we ought to look to the way the very early Christians operated? If they're talking about what our political means should be. Not that I know much about it. I wonder, because given that we can't use the structures of our society, we can't, if we set up a political party, it's going to end up being part of the same game as the other political parties. What other means are there? What other kind of models of action are there for us?
I think looking to our forefathers in the faith is very is astute, and that is something we should be doing. I'm sure you've heard of the Benedict option, which was written by a Catholic apostate. And is imbued with all sorts of liberal presuppositions. And I don't think that idea is original either. A lot of people have been talking about separating from Babylonian structures. But I do think that idea of divesting from Babylonian, our time, talent, and treasure from Babylonian structures is quite instructive. And it is true that I think there will be what I call it the little way of Christendom, a kind of grassroots effort which does correspond to the experience of the ancient Christians. But what were the symptoms of that beginning to take place? Well, actually, it was people going out to the desert or to the wilderness later on to found monasteries. So I think that revival of religious life will be the sign, because, of course, as our Lord says, seek first the kingdom of heaven, all these other things will be given unto you. Christendom is all those other things at a corporate level, but it's preceded by the evangelical councils. So I think once we start seeing more of that, then that will be a real sign of hope. But yeah, I do think looking to the ancient Christians is very instructive. And I wouldn't say entirely that there's nothing within the current structures. I think you've just got to be very careful. If you're in Leicestershire now and the Reform Council has taken down the rainbow flag on the cap, that's a good thing. That's good. But it's just seeing that as some kind of lasting solution which kind of lulls you back to sleep. And I think for the mass of kind of apostatite or unchristianized people, it sort of delays repentance as well, conservatism, whereas they actually need to feel the effects of their sins, and that will maybe provoke repentance.
So is Newbury Town Centre the equivalent of the desert that we should be going to?
Maybe, but I think the desert is the desert. I think it will actually be going to the Welsh mountains and getting away from the cacophony of modern civilization.
Because Archbishop of Fairham did actually emphasise going more to the countryside and away from the towns and cities, is my understanding.
Yes, back to the land, yeah.
It's quite a connection with the kind of, I can't remember the term, it's sort of removing yourself from things which you said at the beginning was something you didn't condone. Isn't there a risk that by sort of moving to the Welsh Hills you're kind of doing that, escaping and distancing yourself from society a little bit?
Yeah, I think you've got to distinguish between those who are called to religious life.
Yeah.
I think are called to
Hermit.
make the desert bloom,
Yeah.
to go to the wilderness. But no, for families in the world, I think no, we're very much called to be within society. And I hope that this was a kind of reaffirmation of the laity's political vocation. But it's just the wider expanse of what that means, and how that can take the form of our own initiatives, our own Catholic action. So, for example, founding Catholic businesses. The laity have a genius of forming institutions, you might say. So we're founding Catholic families. The next step is to found Catholic guilds, Catholic businesses, almshouses, hospitals, schools, all those different institutions. I think that's going to create that sort of pole of attraction as well for the secular world as it continues to decompose. It's going to be more and more attractive.
The other things are incredibly difficult to pull together, aren't they? Pull together an arms house or something like that. So there's going to be an immediate period where you're just not going to get anywhere because you lack the means. What objectives? I've not yet heard in all this, and I think we can all agree with the principles that you've set out. But just in very, very practical terms, political action, Catholic political action, okay, so you start with the formation because obviously you're not going to disseminate what you don't know. But I've yet to hear, or I'm wondering whether you've heard of any examples of anyone anywhere where they've managed to set out the priority of goals. You've got a goal to go for. I would suggest that getting an arms house together is not necessarily the immediate thing that's going to get you the forward motion.
Yeah, it's contextual. It's contextual. I do think we have to think a bit more localised. We've all got very globalised minds. This has come up with this discourse around order amoris and the idea of sort of solving problems overseas rather than looking to our own neighbourhoods. So we need to remember subsidiarity and the fact that we are called to subject to the kingship of Christ our own particular locales first of all. But it's going to look different, and I think it's going to be gradualist. But what I'm calling for is not a complete withdrawal from political action. I mean, I know Catholics who spoke to MPs before the euthanasia bill, and they actually changed their minds. So that was, concrete, fruitful activity at the Westminster level, which, okay, it failed. But it's still, it was on a knife edge, that vote. So there is work to be done. I'm talking about where do we devote the preponderance of our resources. At the moment, the preponderance of our resources, it seems, from what I've seen, is towards having a Catholic influence in the Tory party, for example, rather than forming Catholic institutions, lay institutions. So, yeah, it's a big question, but I think, this is about winning over rich Catholics as well, people who donate a lot to pro-life causes and so on, which that's very important as part of the fight, but although the pro-life movement embraces a lot of liberal presuppositions as well. So I think there's kind of a lot of, for example, imagine a rich Catholic that just bought a load of land, said, right, I'm establishing here a commons for Catholic families to come. We're going to, reinstitute this form of common property, which is something that was very characteristic of the Christian order in this country and across Europe. It breaks down individualism because you have to cooperate over that shared resource. So, I think it's just kind of more thinking outside the box. And actually, Father Crean had an idea in this regard. He said, well, why not start a political party where you advocate for the most, we would just say it's sensible, but to the world's eye, very controversial policies, because, of course, the way things work now, all publicity is good publicity. It's all just dominating the news cycle. So he said, start a political party where you advocate, your headline policy is the execution of doctors who mutilate children. Right? That's a policy which which a majority of people would actually agree with. The media would be hysterical about, but actually everyone watching at home is going, oh yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And if you said without any kind of fear and full conviction, then that could really create a kind of hinge issue to sort of at least throw sand in the gears of the system.
Can I just finish off by asking, are there any other examples in any other countries in the world where something is occurring? What does it look like?
Very limited, of course, because of the church crisis. So we can no longer say, well, this is Catholic teaching, because our bishop will turn around and go, no, you're discriminating against Americans or something, or against LGBT. So we have the betrayers on the clerk, the betrayal of the clergy, to contend with, many of the clergy. So yeah, without that sanction from the official church, it's very difficult. I can't think of it. I think in Poland there's like the closest to a traditionalist Catholic party that you can finance led by a chap called Gregors Brown, who is quite interesting. But yeah, I haven't seen anything. In America, there's some ideas happening. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so I'd have to counteract that sort of
Please.
statement in that sense from personal experience, from my father effectively being incarcerated, but taking that exact position of perhaps headlines of drastic headlines, to the extent that I think the populace as a whole, and as you quite rightly stated, they would probably reject a statement of, as he said, doctors that would be incarcerated for
Execute.
for executing so on. The question that I also got then, from my own perspective, I can't really cast judgment on the rest of the room, but from my own experience as well, how do you counteract liberalism within a global workforce? For example, the company that I work for is a multinational workforce. It's a $6 billion business run out to the States. But there's no opportunity to really voice any argument with Catholicism without any HR. Under some sort of speech announcement or something. What is the argument there? Because what ends up happening is you end up becoming silent, becoming rejected perhaps by your own ability to argue it. Because the moment you write up a Teams message, for example, to your colleagues that you don't necessarily agree with, Pride, or Island Pacific Month, or X, Y, and Z Month, and so on. What is the argument against that? Because realistically it has to start with a voice. But that voice will then probably have you losing your job. How do you argue?
Yeah, we've got to work within the parameters that we've got. So, appreciate you mentioned your father's experience there. I mean, we still in this country, I think one of the advantages we do have, we're talking at dinner about some of the advantages in France, but they're different to the ones we have. I think that the structure of the common law system, which of course has all sorts of miscarriages of justice, but nevertheless, I think still retains enough of its medieval Catholicism that there is still public speech that you could make which would be beneficial to the kingdom of Christ. So that's the first thing, is kind of, being adroit about what you say and exactly how the legal coverage you have. But I think it's a bit like COVID, it's like they said you had to wear a mask, but actually, I never wore one. I was only accosted once. You can always push boundaries a bit further than
I think you can within society, but within a global environment, within a work environment. That boundary gets you to...
I agree. I mean, I used to work for a multinational consultancy. And that's a key reason why I left. And I do think, if I had sons, I would advise that I would not recommend they work for large corporations. They are at the cutting edge of the revolution. And I think, and they are some of the most ruthless entities, which is transcribed in law with fiduciary responsibility and so on, to actually maximise profits for shareholders and what's it called, DIE and Sustainable Development Goals. There's actually a whole mechanism of control there where if a particular company that is part-owned or leveraged by BlackRock does not have a Pride Month, then Larry Fink will be on the phone saying, if you don't do this, we will crash your share price. So there are whole mechanisms of control, and I think we should really be retreating from that. Of course, different situations, we can do that at different stages. But really, I think you have to work for small businesses and a human scale of things, because those faceless corporate entities, they are, as you say, they're kind of supranational, so you can't even have recourse to the law of the land as much. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested in sort of the manner in which we evangelise and we speak to our colleagues at work and people in our lives, and broadly as a community. And obviously we see all these hot button issues. You've got LGBT stuff, you've got gender ideology, you've got abortion, all these hot button issues where there's a Catholic position on it. Do you think it's actually maybe counterproductive to be facing these individual issues head on and saying, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong? Because is that fighting on their ground and sort of trying to win at their own game? Because they're bringing forth these issues and then we're sort of reacting. And do you think, because I have these discussions with people at work, probably too vocal a lot of the time, and I find myself just almost fighting on their ground.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think it's more useful to sort of be focusing on the underlying principles by which our faith is based? That use, that justice, and that real debt obligation,
I think that, again, it's very contextual and personal based on the relationship with these people. But grace perfects nature, so I think that presumes a rightly ordered nature, understanding of the natural law. And if someone can't admit or can't apprehend that dismembering babies and abortion is wrong, then it's very limited what you can say, I think, to be honest. I mean, I'm quite... I think there's people who have ears that listen, and I find often among young men, for example, today, less common among young women, maybe that's just me, but I find that among my students, that among secular people there is more receptivity now among the younger generation. They've only known really a kind of continuous disorder and a hostile state, especially again for men. So they're receptive. But I would say truth is always truth should be aired. That is a virtuous act in itself to proclaim truth. So I would fight on these issues.
I suppose my concern is being seen as more of against things than for something.
Yeah. Well, it's in a social context. I mean, if they're seeing you argue, but then also they're seeing you, I've got a call from my wife at lunchtime, and we have a really wholesome and rightly ordered relationship, and then they see you pick up your kids. It's all of that which is very particular to relationships, but that's the affirmation, is the fact that you actually lead a rightly ordered life, and all the things that you're not involved in. You're a good worker. You're punctual. You're helpful to others. All those natural virtues. That's all going to testify in its own way.
That's what I was thinking. Is that Peter was asking about practical examples where we're doing something, or people have done things politically and maybe more overtly, but actually a lot of the time it does come down to the things you've just mentioned there about fostering situations like this where everyone here is encouraged by the united thing we're all trying to achieve and restore the kingship of Christ, and how that then, when we go back out into the world, manifests itself in the way we interact with people who aren't Catholic and aren't trying to achieve that goal. And maybe if they have an inkling that you are a Catholic or there's something different about you, and they're interested in what that is, that sometimes maybe is enough of a spark for some people to influence them and make a difference.
Yeah, at least to plant a seed.
And not to be demoralised by the idea that, we're not creating a political party, we're actually doing something.
But I think year by year that gets more and more effective. I do think that.
Yeah.
People are getting more and more receptive. I do think.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions.
Okay.
Somebody who said that atheism was the foundation of Christendom. Would you have anything to say about that? I have no idea, honestly. I don't have a pre-made answer to that question. And secondly, would you say that the concept of hierarchy of truth has distorted the Catholic mind insofar as we look to the truth of faith as more true instead of more important than lesser truths of reality?
So firstly, the question about entryism, that's an interesting parallel. I think that it doesn't quite hold, because the parallel would be, or the analogy would be that figures like St. Augustine were saying, well, we can burn a pinch of incense to Caesar just so that they'll think better of Christians and stop persecuting us. It's crossing that line into breaking our Lord's teaching.
I have more in mind, say, St. John the Baptist, when he came to soldiers and said, just they asked what we have to do, and he said, take your pain and do what you're doing.
Yes.
And arguably they were supporting the military forces of the Romans.
Yes.
So just in that
The powers that be are ordained of God. I'm not advocating. I don't think it's at all Catholic to advocate revolution. Overthrowing King Charles III or something. No. We want to convert King Charles III. We pay our taxes. That doesn't mean that we recognise the right to the law to enact abortion as in fact real law. It's an act of violence. It's not true law. So that's the danger I perceive of the entryism I described, which is to affirm, a part at an earlier stage of the revolution. For example, reform, you'd be saying, well, Mohammedanism is a great threat to liberalism, to freedom of worship. You'd be saying that LGBT is a threat to feminism and women's rights. You'd be affirming all these pathologies from earlier in the revolution in order to combat later metastatization. And I think that's just always bound to fail. It either leads to disenchantment politically or losing the faith. I think it's quite serious. Look at J.D. Vance saying that access to the abortion pill is something that he would support maintaining. He shouldn't be given communion just as much as Biden should for that. And the second question was the hierarchy of truths.
kind of related, because you're talking here about one affirmation being used against another. So do you see this crop up in Catholic discourse as well, where higher truths are used to filter out less important truths, in the sense that less important truths are somehow perceived as less true, if you know what I mean?
That's the beauty, as I'm sure everybody in this room has experienced, of becoming more and more immersed and familiar with the Church's doctrine, is that you see how beautifully everything fits together. And that, okay, there are areas of legitimate disagreement among theologians. But in the political, philosophical sphere, really, it's one of a very coherent tradition and affirming tradition, mutually affirming tradition, through the doctrine of the two swords, right up until the French Revolution and then liberal Catholicism, which comes afterwards. But it's not contradictory at all. So, yes, there's disagreement about means, and that's the interesting role for the laity, is how to apply the Church's doctrine. And that's what I would say is perhaps fruitful for political activities, is to form discussion groups and actually think about how these doctrines would be applied today. So but I don't think that I can't really think of examples of where lesser truths are sort of ignored or violated to enact higher truths.
Well, where somebody might say, for example, well, we all believe in blessed Trinity, we all believe in incarnation, so let's ignore what's happening in political sphere or in the world, because we just adhere to God and we that sort of thing.
That's a kind of pathology that arises from liberalism, because it separates church and state, and then that works its way into people's souls. So it leads to kind of Gnosticism or quietism, a kind of angelism, where it's like, the political world is contaminated, is dirty. You get this is kind of the other side of liberalism and clericalism in a certain sense, is where again people are encouraged to just be within the Catholic world and not have a political life at all. That's false. That's very false. Yeah, we are obligated to help to promote the principles of the Christian order and to make sure that Christ is recognised in his kingship, a dignity befitting his divinity. So yeah, the lay role is to consecrate the temporal sphere, and the clerical role is to, teach, sanctify, and govern the laity so that they then consecrate the temporal sphere. As the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." And this can get, again, people can criticise us and say, "Oh, you're talking about heaven on earth." No, but we are called to build the kingdom of heaven on earth, an anticipation of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but we are obligated to try. Yes.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about the almost the compromise of Leo XIII and the ralliement. Do you think that was? There's been a lot of discussion on this throughout history, but do you think that's an example of a sort of compromise with potentially some of the liberal principles, or was it really just a kind of a prudential decision at the time? And you think it was, ultimately, it seems like it wasn't. Maybe it didn't have any fruit, and it was regretted deeply by Leo XIII. But do you think, potentially today, obviously now with the Pope, Leo XIV, do you think potentially he chose that because let's say the liberals today, they kind of identify Leo XIII, maybe falsely, as one of their own?
Yes, I think there is that perception, definitely. There's a sort of whole alternative universe where Leo XIII is the first liberal Pope, and they sort of misconstrue his social teaching to be some kind of species of leftism and these distortions. So I think, the ralliement, it was probably conceived of as just a prudential action, and it was alongside his great social teaching. So he, I think, would say, well, recognising the situation in Europe in particular, the world, but Europe in particular as it is, the great Catholic monarchies have fallen. Christendom is crumbling, at least in regards to the old Catholic dynasties. And so I am going to give to you I'm going to argue for Christendom from the abstract. I'm going to give to you the social teaching which you go through, and that will build Christendom. That has all the principles there in his great body of social documents. That's in the theoretical order. In the practical order, the ralliement was really saying to the French monarchists, don't give up, you should not be so devoted to, in his mind, a futile effort of trying to restore the traditional Catholic monarchy, and you're just going to alienate other French Catholics who are faithful but are not monarchists. Instead, you should unite and attempt remedial action within the French Third Republic. Now, I think that actually did veer into at least tacitly assuming doctrinal implications, because the French Republic was based on the era of popular sovereignty. So, by participating in it or by affirming it, at least at that stage, I think that it, as was seen by the fruits, you had Catholics who were steadily liberalised and no longer explicit about calling for the social kingship of Christ. And how was that kingship of Christ actually realised in France? It was the baptism of Clovis by Saint Remy, and that is illustrated through the coronation of French kings. So I don't think that's just to be given up on. And what's behind it, I think, is a kind of pastoral considerations that to maintain access to the sacraments for the faithful, but perhaps also a slight discomfort over the fact that liberal regimes are becoming more and more hostile, and it was maybe going to lead to persecution, even martyrdom of the clergy. I don't think that's something that they kind of welcomed, and I think that's something that maybe withholds a lot of clergy today from being more outspoken. I remember when Bishop Thomas Tobin of Rhode Island, he wrote a tweet in response to Pride Month saying, "No Catholics have any business getting involved in this abomination." And then a few days later, he took down the tweet, and he put out this sort of mealy-mouthed, kind of grovelling apology, like want to be considerate towards people, gay Catholics, and so on. And I'm sorry for the offence I've caused. And I would suspect that's sort of an illustrative event of the mechanism of control, where he gets a phone call from someone, they say, we're going to detonate these, abuse scandals or financial scandals or whatever it is, skeletons in the closet, and there's blackmail that goes on. And, you know, I think that's day to day how it, you know, why we don't get the teaching, as it were. Thank you very much.
Yeah.